Good evening. It is about a minute before 6 p.m. We're going to give people a chance to come online and then we will get started. Welcome. Okay, it's 6 o'clock. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Danville Housing Element 101 webinar today. My name is Diane Friedman. I am the Deputy Director of Development Services. We are also joined by Dave Crompton, who is Danville's Chief of Planning, and Diana Elrod, who is our consultant working with us on the Housing Element Update process. And we are also joined by Kat Bravo, the Development Services Administrative Analyst, who will be helping facilitate the slide presentation. We are so pleased to have a conversation with you about housing this evening. You know, what happens around this subject at a community level is now more and more being governed by state laws. Next slide, please. As an overview, we'd like to cover three primary areas with you. The first is the background and the context to the housing element and what is impacting decisions that go into formulating the housing element. The second is we're probably going to share more than you've ever wanted to know about the housing element. And the third area is how you can participate in the process and the roles of the elected and appointed town officials. So we will cover the why, the what, the how, and the who. And lastly, we are here to answer any questions that you may have. And during this presentation, if you notice on the slide, we have a text number that is available. If you have your phone by you, we would love to hear a little bit about your housing story. If you could, in a couple of sentences, text us to let us know either how long you've lived here, what keeps you here, or are you a renter, a homeowner? What's your housing story? That would be very appreciated. Again, the text is 838-484-3328 on the left-hand side of the slide. Next slide, please. But rather than talking at you for the entirety of the evening, we've structured this workshop to be a little interactive. So as a warm-up activity, we'd like to see if you could help us get a better sense of our audience by taking a Zoom survey poll that will appear on your screen. Please select the option that best describes you. I live in Danville, I live nearby, I live outside of the area, all of the above. I think we got that question wrong. Okay. So we have 57% of our participants in. We've got 30 seconds. And let's go ahead and share the results. Oh, so every 100% of our participants this evening live in Danville. All right, moving on. Next slide, please. So we'd like to set the stage for our discussion with some background and context about housing. Next slide. I want to review with you a little bit about housing trends. At the start, by acknowledging that for a long time now, it's been very expensive and remains very expensive, and is continuing to be more expensive to live in California. But as a 2015 report by the State Legislative Analyst Office illustrates, the disparity between California's housing costs and the rest of the nation has grown dramatically over the decades. If you look from the 1940s to 2019, which is the most recent figures that we have, the average cost of a home in the state of California is $523,000. In the rest of the United States, it's $239,000. In California, the average monthly rent is $1,503. And in the US, it's $1,062. So home prices are very, very expensive in the state and also as compared to other states in the country. Next slide, please. Continuing the theme as far as housing trends, the Legislative Analyst Office, and just for reference, the Legislative Analyst Office is an independent office in the state legislature that does analysis on certain bills, certain housing costs, as is referenced here. They do a lot of analyst work for the state legislature. So the analyst report from 2015 shows that the growth in housing costs is the result of a housing supply shortage. And if you look at the trends from the 1940s and you look at the California coast, the trend is that housing has been going down as far as housing productivity on the coast. And most of our major metropolitan areas are along the coast, and most of the housing is moving inland. Next slide, please. The Legislative Analyst Report conclusions are also reflected in a 2018 report by the State Department of Housing and Community Development, known as State HCD. In this report, the number of permits issued for housing units, a leading indicator of housing construction, has never recovered from the Great Recession. If you take a look at this, if you look back into the 60s, the production was as high as 300,000 units per year. It took a little dip in the 60s, but in the 70s, into the 80s, it stayed pretty consistent, pretty high. And then if you look into the 90s, it started dropping. And then in 2008, the Great Recession, the state housing permits, the production of housing has not caught up. You can see the difference between multifamily units and single family units. So housing production has dramatically declined and it has not recovered from the Great Recession of 2008. Next slide, please. So we look at why don't we build more housing, and there are a number of primary factors and reasons for this. Number one is community resistance to growth. People don't want to share their community with congestion and crowds, and there's a lot of resistance to new builds and development in communities. The second is, commercial development, it brings in more local tax revenue, so that it's more attractive from a development standpoint. So the priority is commercial development. There is also another factor that is limited land to build on. And when you have limited land, land is very expensive, and that drives up the cost of development, which is the next factor. And then also project reviews and CEQA, which is the California Environmental Quality Act, either delay or reduce new housing altogether. Next slide. Prior to the pandemic, the housing production was a central focus for Governor Newsom's campaign. His inaugural address included a goal of building 3.5 million housing units by 2025. And if you look at the permit chart that we just showed, that is a stretch goal at best. We have not been able to produce anything more than 80,000 housing units a year for quite some time now. This means that the entire state would need to produce over 850,000 units annually in the next 4 years, and that is far more than historically we have ever built in this state. Next slide, please. So moving on to the state legislature, the state legislature, the governor have declared a housing crisis. Housing has always been a priority for the state legislature. Over 64 bills have been passed over the past 4 years that are intended to expedite housing production. In 2020 alone, 28 bills have been introduced, with Senate Bill 9 receiving press attention, given its intent to eliminate single-family zoning. The California State Legislature, and the theme you will see tonight as far as housing cost burden, there is a problem of affordability. There is a problem of housing stock. The housing stock that California desperately needs is extremely low and low income units. And what is happening now is the state is intervening more and more, and they are taking more and more control of zoning and land use ordinances that are usually local decisions, and they are implementing a one-size-fits-all blanket around trying to solve the housing problem. And their theory is that by production and building housing, it will drive the cost of housing down. Senate Bill 9 is 65% of the land that is used in California is designated in single-family zones. Senate Bill 9 would like to unlock single family zoning, where if you currently have a single family resident right now, Senate Bill 9 will allow a landowner, a single family resident owner, to build a second unit by right, expedited approvals on their lot. And also, if they want to, they can subdivide their lot into 2 lots and add an additional 2 units. So where there was one single family lot now, or one single family unit now, Senate Bill 9 would allow up to 4 units on a single family lot. And there's nothing that precludes this. HOAs, gated communities, this will be a bill, and it is going through the assembly this week. There will be a floor vote on this, and this is making its way through the California state legislature as we speak. Next slide, please. So with the social political context that I just reviewed with you, I'd like to transition the presentation to Diana Elrod to dive into the nuts and bolts of a housing element and what it means to Danville.
Thanks, Diane. Next slide. Well, why does Danville even need a housing element? And the short answer is to comply with state housing element law that was enacted all the way back in 1969. The law acknowledges that cities do not build housing. Instead, it requires each city to accommodate its fair share of the state's projected housing needs by planning for growth and removing constraints to the development of housing. Next slide. But as Diane noted earlier, a growing number of recently adopted state laws now collectively constrain how cities develop their housing elements. This is not even a complete list of the bills that impact how we are writing this cycle's housing element. Next slide, please. What is it exactly? It's a plan that demonstrates to the state of California, because they have to approve it, how we would accommodate the housing that is needed in our community. And the key here is that the state and regional agencies, not the town, determines what the need is. This plan has to be updated every 8 years, and it's the only element of the general plan, the only chapter of the general plan that must be approved by the state. Next slide, please. So what's in it? It's a housing plan with goals, policies, and programs, an analysis of needs, evaluation of constraints, and the identification of sites to meet those needs. And this can be considered somewhat controversial. In fact, most people are very interested primarily in the siting of housing, the potential siting of housing. Next slide. Okay, next quiz. Here it is. We've talked a lot about projected housing needs, and which group do you believe is in charge of developing those housing projections? You'll have 30 seconds to answer the question. We forgot our Jeopardy music. Cat. So, we had 18 people. Okay, the answer is a combination of both the state and the regional government, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Next slide. Okay, so the foundation of the housing element is what's called the Regional Housing Needs Assessment, and it's pronounced RHNA. It involves 3 levels of government. At the state, the role is to produce housing projections every 8 years in groups throughout the state of California. Each region gets a big number. These targets are then assigned regions within California. So for example, here in the Bay Area, there's a group that all 9 counties of the Bay Area get a lump number. The state assigned the San Francisco Bay Area 441,176 units, which is more than twice the size of the last cycle of the housing element. The role of the regional planning agency is to allocate that assignment to its cities and counties. And at the local level, only then, at the very end, do local cities and counties play a role. And the role specifically is to find the land that can accommodate that housing assignment. Next slide, please. So what does this mean for Danville? Right now, it means we have to find enough parcels for a minimum of 2,241 units for the 8-year planning period that begins in 2023 and runs to 2031. And note that this is a minimum assignment, which we'll explain a little bit more later. Next slide, please. It's important to realize that the assignment isn't just 2,241 single-family homes, but homes that have to be affordable in 4 separate income categories. And it is well known that in order for to accommodate lower income households, they need multifamily housing rather than single-family housing because of the cost. Each income category is benchmarked to a percentage of the county's area median income, or AMI. And as a reference point, Contra Costa's AMI for a family of 4 equals about $119,000. That means an equal number of households earn more than that, and an equal number of households earn less than that. That's what the median means. At the end of the income spectrum, a very low income family of 4 earns 50% of AMI, which in this case is about $65,000 per year. And at the other end of the spectrum, an above moderate income family of 4 earns in excess of $143,000 per year. And the income categories matter because higher density zone land is necessary, as I mentioned, multifamily housing, to provide units affordable to the lower end of the income spectrum. And in order for us to accommodate lower income households, the density for those kinds of sites must be at least 30 dwelling units per acre. We call this the default density. Next slide. So this, we won't spend a whole lot of time on this. You can see where Danville is with 2,241 units. And this is all the other jurisdictions within Contra Costa County and what their allocations were. From unincorporated Contra Costa County got the highest number of over 7,600 units. Walnut Creek got 5,800 units. Concord got 5,000 units, and onward, downward. You can see that Clayton has 570 units, and Pinole has 500 units. So it's a broad range, and it's based on a number of factors that went into the development of this. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Next slide, please. And you will ask, who gave us this assignment? And it's the San Francisco Bay Area's regional planning agency called the Association of Bay Area Governments, or ABAG. And one of ABAG's responsibility was to develop a methodology for the distribution of those 441,000 units that were assigned to the Bay Area, to its 101 cities and 9 counties. This leads to our next activity. Could we have the next slide? What main factor do you think ABAG used in its methodology to allocate the units assigned to its cities and counties? Another 30 seconds here, and you can play the Jeopardy theme song in your head if you prefer. The answer is sort of not really any of them. The answer is actually a trick question. It really depends on the income category of the unit. Let's take a look at that if we can. Let's go to the next slide. I'm not going to go into detail explaining this, but basically the methodology, you can see the number at the top of 441,000 units plus. On the left-hand side, you'll see an orange and a lighter orange box that says very low income and low income. So they had these distribution of units. They calculated the methodology based on different factors for the low and very low, compared with moderate income and above moderate income. Just for a rough explanation, very low and low were given a substantial allocation towards areas with high opportunity and job proximity, either by transit or by car. On the other hand, at the upper income categories, there was less of a reliance on the access to high opportunity areas and a greater emphasis on job proximity by auto, presuming that people who are in moderate or above moderate incomes more likely will have autos to get to work. Next slide, please. So what's at stake for non-compliance? Some have already asked this, and what happens if the town decides not to comply? Unfortunately, there are a number of things that would be to the detriment of the city, to the town. Limited access to state funding, such as transportation dollars we use to repave and repair roads. Court-imposed fines up to $600,000 per month. And even if Danville residents are willing to forego revenue in the form of state funding and fines, there's a legal risk involved and a loss of control, which really means courts can mandate compliance by approving housing developments on our behalf without any input and suspending the town's ability to issue building permits. So the authority that we do have would be taken away. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dave to share a little bit about an actual example of a project in Danville.
Okay, Diana, good evening, everybody. So I wanted to dive a little deeper into the real challenges that Danville has and communities like Danville in providing for the low and very low income units that we have been allocated. And you saw it back in one of the earlier slides of the 2,241, almost half of those are supposed to be at the low or very low, which to the state means at least 30 units per acre. So I'm going to use the Left Sun Riverwalk project as a case example. And you probably are all familiar with this. This is the 144 unit apartment project that was built there on Diablo Road on the south side by the southbound on-ramp. And this was actually a RHNA site as part of our last housing element that we changed from an office complex to higher density housing. And 144 units were built. But as part of that project, the applicant invoked what's known as state density bonus law. And that's one of on the list of the slide that was shown earlier by Diana, one of the state laws passed in the last number of years. And that basically says that if the applicant's willing to provide some deed restricted affordable units, that they get extra density. And so the state mandated that the maximum number of affordable units were 10, and they were deed restricted at very low income. But that meant that the remainder, the 134 units, are renting at market rate. And the market rate for those units are about $2,600 to $4,900 a month. And so that basically means that we had planned for 144 affordable units there, but we only got 10. And that gets into our next problem, the next state law, and that is called the no net loss law. And that law basically says that if you had a site that was planned in your housing element for affordable housing, and you don't do it, that means you have to make it somewhere else. And so as we go into our next housing element, we can kind of see that, given the land values in Danville, that's going to be an ongoing problem as we go forward. And Diana talked about the minimum number of units being the 2,241. And the no net loss law is really why That's a minimum because the state is asking us to provide a buffer. That could be up to 30% more units, and that would cover the possibilities that we don't get the affordability that we are expecting out of our higher density housing. And instead of kind of immediately being out of compliance with the housing element, that would allow us to have some buffer and have some additional sites still available. So next slide. And so this leads us into a concept known as housing cost burden. This is a number that is given to us by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. And the concept basically is that a household should not have to spend more than 30% of their household income on housing. And so if they're spending more than 30%, they are housing burdened. And that basically means that they don't have, maybe enough money available for other needs that they may have. Next slide, please. And to go ahead and go a little deeper into our local situation. So this is Danville, and this is an analysis of housing cost burden. And this shows some of the apartment projects that have been built in Danville over the last 10 or 20 years. And what this shows is that at the different affordable income levels that Diana mentioned, if we are talking about the only spending 30% of your income on housing, this kind of shows that, well, under market rate in Danville, really none of these listed here would be available without cost burdening the renter or owner. There's a few more at low. There's a few projects in Danville that would qualify as low, and a few at moderate. But the takeaway here is the most recent project, and that's the Alexon down the Riverwalk project. And as you can see, because this was the most recent, and this is based on the most recent land costs and construction costs, there's a huge jump, even from 10 years ago to the current. And you can see that in the Alexon Riverwalk, we have numbers like you'd have to spend 78% of your income at very low, and even 35% at moderate. So again, this kind of shows the challenges that we have in providing for the affordable housing and not cost burdening the residents. Next slide, please. So now that we have piqued your interest and you want to tell your family and friends and some of your neighbors, you're going to want to stay tuned, because this is the process that we're going through for the next year or so, year plus. And next slide, please. I'm going to talk about the process that we're going to go through, what we've been doing and what we're going to go through, and the timing involved with it. So we've launched this type of public outreach. We want to really educate the Danville community on what the state laws are kind of mandating for us to do, and what the challenges that we have ahead of us. So we're doing these Housing 101 seminars. We reached out individually to different groups, like we're going to meet with the Chamber of Commerce. We've met with real estate groups, most recently the Kiwanis group. And so we're kind of trying to get out in the community and get this information out there. And we really want to make sure everybody understands and everybody can participate as we go forward in kind of helping us prioritize where we might find lands for additional density, housing density. We've created a really nice website with some interactive tools, and Diane is going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But as far as the timeline going forward, coming, getting into spring, summer of 2022, we're going to have to be pulling together a draft housing element. It's going to have to show, what lands in Danville we're going to repurpose or change the general plan for a higher density housing to meet our RHNA. Again, that's a real challenge in Danville. We don't have a lot of vacant lands. So, how are we going to do that? We're going to have to do environmental assessment and environmental impact report to look at potential impacts for any lands that we want to upzone to multifamily, such as traffic, noise, air quality, biological impacts, etc. And then before we actually get into an approval process, we will submit our draft housing element to the State Department of Housing and Community Development, HCD, who will take a review at it, will take a look at it for us and give us feedback. And if we have to make any changes, we will. Then we'll start the public hearing process. And next slide, please. For most communities, including Danville, the formal hearing process will include hearings in front of the Danville Planning Commission, which is made up of 8 individuals that are appointed volunteers by the town council. So they will hold notice to public hearings. They will make a recommendation to the town council, and ultimately the town council will adopt a package of general plan changes for housing, associated rezonings, the environmental impact report, and the housing element itself. And that needs to be done by January of 2023. So we have just about a year and a half to get to that point. Next slide. And this is Diane, who's on mute. We haven't turned over you to.
Sorry, David. All right, I'm gonna take it from here as far as how we are engaging the community. We have launched an online engagement portal, and it is www.danvilletowntalks.org. It serves as a source of facts about the laws and the processes for the housing element update. We can capture and respond to questions. You know, what we're trying to do is to emphasize that this is a way that you can communicate to us directly by going to this portal and sharing your stories and your questions. And speaking of questions, we have a Q&A session at the end of this webinar. So we already have some questions coming in. If you use the Q&A feature on your toolbar, we will be happy to stay as long as needed to answer any of your questions. But you know, really, this is the portal that we can talk to you. It's not one-way communication, it's two-way communication, and we really want to hear from you. And this will help us, you know, make informed decisions about this whole process with your ideas and your thoughts, because we are definitely all in this together and we want everybody's feedback. As Dave mentioned, we are really reaching out by social media. We're doing meetings with community groups. Next slide, please. So ways that you can participate in this process. You can subscribe to the news feed at danvilletowntalks.org, housing element, and we send out regular updates as to what we're doing weekly and how we're continuing our outreach weekly. Learning about housing and the governing legislation to provide informed input. I provide a legislative update to the town council at the second town council meeting of the month, which is the you know, and we also have a legislative committee which meets of the town council, and we review current legislation, proposed legislation, pending legislation, and make decisions on how Danville advocates for legislation or against legislation, such as the housing legislation that's coming. Engage in the process. Please let your neighbors know to, you know, this is a very important topic that we're talking about. Please participate in the webinars, ask questions. We had surveys that went out in our last newsletter with self-addressed stamped surveys. So if you could please send those back, contribute an idea through our portal, you know, anything that will provide us with information to guide us along this process. Next slide, please. And Diana mentioned earlier on, she talked about the RHNA process. On July 9th, the town of Danville submitted an appeal to the RHNA numbers that we were assigned. The Association of Bay Area Governments will accept comments on submittals for the appeals from until August 30th, 5 p.m. on August 30th. If you as a community member would like to send in your comments, the information is rhna@bayareametro.gov. This information is also available on our website. There will be an appeal hearing. We are waiting for that date. So there are different ways that you can participate. You can also sign up for the RHNA mailing list at the web address below. And again, all this information is available on our website, but you know, the community does have options for getting involved in this RHNA appeal process, and we wanted to make you aware of that. Next slide, please. And I think we are in webinar number 4 or 5. It's all a blur to us right now, but we have 2 more to go. Tuesday, August 31st at 6 p.m. and Saturday, September 18th at 10 a.m. So please, again, get the word out. We have flyers at the farmers market. Our town council's out there every weekend. We continue to publish this information. So if you could continue to get the word out to have everyone participate, that would be appreciated. Next slide, please. If you are interested in state legislation, I am a contact. I am the staff legislative lead. I work with our lobbyist, Townsend Public Affairs. For a little bit more about state legislation, the town is very actively involved in advocating on behalf, you know, at the direction of town council on behalf of our community members. We belong to a Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, and that is of the cities of Livermore, Pleasanton, San Ramon, and Dublin, which when you pull everybody together, it's about 365,000 community members, which brings us up to a top 10 voice in the state of California. We leverage those resources and we coalesce around bills and legislation and work with the lobbyists that is on legislation that is impacting Danville. In fact, your Mayor Morgan, just participated in federal advocacy meetings last week with Congressman Swalwell and Senator Dianne Feinstein's office and Senator Padilla's office. So we are constantly engaged and around legislative advocacy. If you are interested in finding out more, you can contact me. My information's on the website as well. And you can also, right now, Senate Bill 9, the housing bill is currently going to be voted on actually next week on the Assembly floor. So Assemblymember Rebecca Bauer-Cahan will be voting on that bill. And then it will be going back to the Senate. And then Senator Steve Glazer from District 7, who you all voted into office, or maybe not voted in, but that's our elected official. He will also be voting on it very shortly. And next slide, please. So now we're available to answer any questions. So we have about 8 I see queued up, Kat.
Yes. So the first question we received is asking if accessory dwelling units can count as additional housing units.
I'm happy to answer that one. The answer is yes. What we have to do is project an expected number of ADUs going forward during the eight-year period, and we can count those against our RHNA allocation. And we're waiting right now for some final decision-making by the state that would allow us to count some of those units at low and very low income, as well as mod and above mod. So that helps some of our needs at the lower income level.
And if I could just add on to that, just historically in Danville, I think we found that ADUs tend to be, well integrated into neighborhoods, and they seem to make sense. People generally are more favorable with ADUs than with larger housing projects. So we have advocated and we have, kind of encouraged ADUs over the years, and we actually created an ADU cottage program where we have had an architect prepare pre-designed and pre-engineered plans that are available on our website for free for Danville residents. So we would like to get as many ADUs as we can, because as Diana said, we could project those forward and that can offset our RHNA number.
Great. The next question we got is, how does water, power, sewer, schools, and other resources required factor into meeting this requirement?
Do you want me to answer that, David? Or do you?
Yeah, no, go ahead and I'll. fill in
As part of the environmental review process, all of those kinds of issues related to the community will be evaluated and will be presented to the town council for determination of what the best way to address the housing needs are and what needs to be done in order to accommodate them. The one thing that is somewhat separate from the evaluation, there will be some discussion about projected number of student population, et cetera, that basically school districts are responsible for their own planning for it, and obviously will be in communication with any school district in order to make sure that they're aware of what our analyses are showing.
All right, I'm going to take this question a little bit further. How does the current water shortage in California affect our process?
It becomes a potential constraint to the development of housing, which we'll discuss in the housing element, and also we'll be including it in the environmental evaluation. This is an issue not only for Danville, but for pretty much all of the Bay Area, much of California. And so some decisions will have to be made about how best to address those, if they can be addressed, and it's ultimately up to the town council to decide the best avenue of approach.
Great. The next question is, have we enlisted any lobbyists in Sacramento, and how do we avoid the density bonus problem that happened at the Riverwalk development?
I can take the lobbyist. As I mentioned before, for I'd say over 15 years now, we have worked as a Tri-Valley Cities Coalition, and we have worked with lobbyists both in Washington, D.C. at the federal level, and also in Sacramento. Our current lobbyist is Townsend Public Affairs. We have met with the Senate Pro Tem's office. We have met with committee members throughout this legislative session. We send briefings and comments in and try to do everything that we can to be a voice at the table in Sacramento to recommend the region and Danville's best interests. We have a good reputation up there as far as providing input on some of the legislation, either to mitigate it, or if it's, if it is not a good piece of legislation, for us to do anything that we can to oppose it. So we have a very, very active town, and we do work with a lobbyist, and we do white papers. We provide the legislators with information about how local development is done, how important local decisions are. Right now, we have a legislative committee meeting on Tuesday with another update. So your town council is very, very involved in what's happening in Sacramento and at the federal level. And Dave, maybe you can talk about.
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, regarding the density bonus and the way Alexon, that's the state law, and so it's really prescribed that if a developer is willing to provide X affordability, then they are entitled to X density bonus, and that's state law. Really, if there's a problem, if we're interested in affordability, those 10 units that were as a result of the density bonus law were the only affordable units we got out of that project. So if anything, it doesn't go far enough. If we want to get more affordability out of our projects. So that project was general planned at 30 units an acre, and with the density bonus, it was almost at 40 units per acre. And still only those 10 units are affordable, and the rest at market rate are not being rented at an affordable level.
And just to, tag on to that, that is one of the issues that we brought up to Sacramento about the legislation that needed to change around the density bonus law, because it actually hurt us rather than helped us. And, the concern is that you look at a bill like Senate Bill 9, and there's not an affordability component in it. And it also, if somebody does choose to do a lot split and build 3 additional units on a single family lot, the burden of that infrastructure falls on the town, which eventually falls, on the taxpayers. There aren't any additional provisions in these bills for mitigating fees for sewer or any other cost burdens that would be spurred by some of this, what they refer to as gentle density or missing middle housing. So I know that we do an environmental impact, but some of the state legislation that's happening right now doesn't mitigate for some of the bills that they want to pass around housing.
Great, thank you. The next question is, there is a growing population of unhoused people in Danville. Are there any efforts to build for those?
Well, I think that is what the housing element effort is all about. And, I think if we're talking about unhoused population in Danville, we're probably talking about people who would like to live here. And, maybe we're talking about, people that grew up in Danville that would like to come back and live here, or people that work in Danville that can't afford to work in Danville. So the intent of the RHNA numbers given to us at the different affordable levels would be to accommodate those populations. So it's just a matter of, the challenges we have with our land values, just the construction costs statewide makes even higher density development in Danville hard to be affordable.
I'll just add here, I was reading a report yesterday that the cost of development for a single unit of multifamily housing in the Bay Area right now is around $800,000. That's just the development cost. That's not profit or anything else. And that takes into consideration land cost, materials cost, labor costs, all of which are very high. And so you can see that there's a huge disconnect between what a person of a lower income can afford and the cost to actually produce that housing. This is one reason why there's not a lot of housing being built for lower income households.
And just a little bit of, more information is, there has to be financing. If a developer is going to build a market rate house versus the cost of a low or an extremely low income affordable unit, it's the same cost burden. And the financing that is riskier for a developer to borrow, and the state really needs to help intervene by putting more financial resources in to get the types of housing built that we need to be built, because the only incentive right now in some of these bills and what we've been saying is if there's not an affordable and an extremely low or low income, we're incentivizing developers to build market rate housing, which is exacerbating the problem.
Great. The next question is, can taller high rises be built to help meet the numbers?
Well, that's basically what, the types of questions that we need to answer going forward. We have a lot of units to accommodate. One of the questions and, one of the reasons we want to engage with the community is, would we want to spread these out and kind of keep the 3-story type of character that historically we've had in Danville, or do we want to find suitable sites and end up with less acreage of housing, but higher densities and higher, more stories? So those are all options that we have in front of us that we'll be considering as we go forward.
Great. The next question is, can low income or very low income housing be targeted for seniors?
The answer is yes. There are rules in place that allow a developer to create housing for lower income seniors and not run against fair housing laws, which says you can't discriminate on the basis of age, among other things. But in the state of California and federally, there are allowances for specifically for senior households. What we really need, though, is developers of senior housing developments. And these are going to be a special kind of a developer, of any kind of affordable developer is going to be doing projects that would be 100% affordable. So we would have to attract a developer who would want to do that kind of development in Danville.
Great. The next question is, does the challenge of finding affordable or available space become easier if it coordinates across the Tri-Valley group of towns and cities?
Theoretically, I'd say yes, but unfortunately, the law says that we have to do this within Danville. And there are not really a lot of easy ways to sort of work across jurisdictions in order to comply with housing element law. I mean, I know that Dave, you probably have a lot of experience working, in a more regional context. But for the purpose of the housing element, this is within the confines of Danville.
Yeah, so, every city has their, their RHNA assignment. And, there may be some cities out there that want more housing. But I think everybody's kind of challenged to provide the housing they're being asked to provide. And so it's kind of, we're all on our own, I guess.
All right, and then we have another question. It just looks like there's some confusion on how we meet our allocated numbers. And in order to get to that, if a developer is invoking the density bonus law, because we're only getting a small percentage of the units that are going to be built on a development to be allocated to low income. It appears that we would then have to build much more units. So how do we do that?
If we rely only on density bonus law, that would be true, but we're hopeful, and what other jurisdictions around will do is try to attract affordable developers that do entirely affordable projects. And as Diane said, the financing for that is very difficult. It's difficult for the reason that rental prices are so high is they're covering their cost. And with affordable developments, you have to cobble together financing from a variety of sources, sometimes as many as 10 or 12 different financing sources, that they can't just go to a bank and get it all there. They have to actually work to put it together. So that's what makes it so challenging. But we can use a combination of things in order to reach the allocation. Remember, the town is not tasked with building these units. The town is tasked with planning for them. So the issue specifically with Riverwalk was that site had been identified as a good site for affordable, and since it did not go completely affordable, those units that were in the category of needing to be located now have to go somewhere else. So it's a bit of a planning activity, I would say. It's a very strategic planning activity that's in front of us, especially with the number of units that we have.
Great, and that is all the questions that we have.
All right.
All right. Well, we are available. Please check out our Danville Town Talks. Get the word out to the community. We are available for meetings. Dave and I like to go on the road. We got lunch last time. We were very excited about that. So we want to thank you for participating tonight, and have a good evening.
Good night, everybody. Thank you.